value. Now value is property. Understood? I hope many of you know that. Elements have properties. Tags have attributes. HTML comprises of elements. Elements are presented by using tags. When you write anything in a tag, those are all called attributes. And when you are dynamically dealing them, then you call them as properties. Sometimes the property name and attribute name may be same. Majority times it is same. Many times the property name and attribute name will change. Do you know, generally in input you have an attribute called class is equal to some text primary, that is the class. Do you know how to apply dynamically CSS class? To apply dynamically CSS class, get element by ID txt name dot class name. This is property, right? Sometimes see, in the tag value the same name property is present, but class, it is not the same name property. Its property name is class name, its attribute is class. That means tag text box tag is having class attribute, and it is having class name property. Dynamically, if I want to apply class, then I have to apply this property for this property. That means dynamically, if you want to apply anything, then it is recommended to apply to the properties. To the properties. If you try to apply to the attributes, then your framework, which is trying to handle HTML dynamically, may not recognize it. That means many times some are missing also. Some attributes are missing. They are not available at all as property. For example, you know, we have TD, table data, has call span. That means usually table is having table is having an attribute called call span. I think everybody know, but important is call span is not available as a property. Do you know, many people may not know that even border is also not available as a property, is not available as a property for images and other elements. Border is also not available as a property. That means you apply border, you apply call span, but they are not available as properties. So that means now the point is the data that comes can be binded to directly attribute or to property. How to bind to attribute, how to bind to properties, how do we represent properties? These are important. So in Angular, especially because Angular is trying to handle your HTML dynamically, then it always prefers property binding. Always prefers property binding. However, if the property is not available, so then it can even handle attribute binding. But first priority is property binding. First priority is property binding. If the properties are not available, then secondary you can go with attribute binding. You can go with attribute binding. That is important to understand how to handle that situation. So this all I will explain with the points. We will see that what we can do here. Now, if I am writing like this, then it is attribute. Attribute binding, that means is equal to, here I need to bind that username. Then we have to use if data binding expression. Through the data binding expression, I am accessing that username. username and binding it. So that means through a data binding expression, you are accessing that and binding to an attribute. Then we call this mechanism as interpolation. Interpolation is binding to binding to attribute by using by using by using by using the binding expression. By using the binding expression is called as interpolation. Interpolation is a technique where we bind to attribute by using this method. So observe now, once we binded it and we saved, and you can see that John is here. The same John is here. That means what you need to observe here is actually in our TS file. So .ts file, we have username and is equal to, so username is equal to John. And important, this John is binded here. This John is binded here. That means this is binded here. Now, very important is, if I make any change here, that change should be updated here. If it is updated there, it should be updated here also automatically, because it is binded now. That means any change inside this view, inside the view, should be updated here. It should be updated here. If it is updated here, then obviously it should show those changes here. So let's go to the design now. And I am changing this John to David. It is not working. It's not working. Means it is not updated. That means it is one-way rendering. Bring it and display. It is not updating. Any changes in the view are not updated to the model. This is one-way binding. Angular uses this one-way binding technique, and this is important in one-way binding. I hope everyone is clear with this. It can use property binding. So property binding, that means actually value is available as a property also. Then what we have to do, how to bind to properties? Then what you can do is, you can put properties are written like this. In a square brace, we write property. And property name also same. Property name is value. And here I am defining so that here no need of binding expression. If it is property, Angular can directly bind. So because Angular can understand the properties dynamically, and we can directly bind by collecting the username and displaying. That is the ability. That means why we don't need interpolation here, because Angular can identify the properties dynamically, and whatever data available in the model, it can bind to that particular property. It doesn't require any interpolation technique. Now you can see that this is also working fine. I will save this. Suppose here I changed the name to some other name. And save it, and you can see that is binded to that by using a property binding technique. And you can see, so I will refresh that, and you can see it is working fine. But remember, this is also one-way binding only. I make the change, then it is not working. This is also one-way binding only. Important is either you bind to attribute or you bind to property. Suppose I want to apply a class. Usually, how do we apply the class? For example, suppose I am defining like this. I want to apply some class. So class is actually property. Suppose I said BG, BG